Tonight we begin with a building that is still working. It is somewhere in the middle of the 2nd millennium BC on the island of Crete, in a complex of rooms and courts that much later visitors will call the Palace of Knossos. The name is not the one its builders used. We do not know the name they used. We do not know what they called themselves either. But the building is real, and this evening it is busy. Storerooms run along one side of it. Jars taller than a child stand in rows, holding oil and grain and other things worth keeping. A scribe presses marks into wet clay to record a delivery. The marks belong to a script we call Linear A, and they have never been read. Above the storerooms there are painted walls, bulls, processions, women in bright clothes, animals that were never seen on this island. Outside, the sea is a short journey away, and ships have been arriving from that sea for centuries. The people who lived here are usually called the Minoans. That name is not ancient. It was given to them in the 20th century by an English archaeologist named Arthur Evans, who borrowed it from a Greek legend about a king called Minos. We will come back to Evans later because what he did to this place became part of the story. For now, only a few things need to be true. Crete was not one city. Knossos stood in the north. Phaistos lay in the south. Malea sat farther east along the coast. Zakros looked out from the eastern end of the island. Each had courts, storerooms, workshops, and administrative habits. They shared styles and symbols, though they were not always united under one state. These centers had been broken before. Around 1700 BC, many of them were destroyed or badly damaged, and the people who lived there rebuilt them on a larger scale. Walls rose again. Courts were cleared. Fresh plaster covered old damage, and new paintings went onto the walls. Then, in the 17th or 16th century BC, the volcanic island of Thera erupted north of Crete. Ash fell. Coastlines were struck. A maritime network was damaged in ways that are still argued about. Crete survived that. The palace doors opened again. Goods continued moving through the magazines. Painters continued working. The old civilization was wounded perhaps, changed perhaps, but alive. Tonight is about what comes after the survival. The slow end of the Minoan world. The arrival of rulers who spoke Greek. The centuries of forgetting. And the men who came back to this hill 3,000 years later with shovels and decided what all of it meant. The building is still working. Then, generations later, destruction comes again. This time, the pattern is different. Around 1450 BC, destruction spreads across Crete. The date is approximate, and individual sites have their own sequences, but the pattern is broad enough to matter. Major centers are damaged or abandoned, including Phaistos, Malea, and Zakros. Other settlements and elite buildings suffer as well. Fire appears at many sites. The old palatial system changes dramatically. Knossos is the great exception. It survives, at least for a time. This is one of the central problems in Minoan history. What happened? The easy answers are tempting. Earthquake, invasion, civil war, revolt, economic collapse after Thera, Mycenaean attack from the mainland. The problem is that a list of possible causes is not the same thing as a solution. Different forces can also combine. A society weakened by earlier disruption may be more vulnerable to political conflict. An earthquake can damage defenses and storage. a rival can take advantage of the damage. A local rebellion can succeed because outside trade has already failed. History does not owe us one clean cause. The archaeological evidence after the destructions, however, becomes increasingly Mycenaean in character. Mainland Greek influence had existed before. Mycenaean elites admired and adopted Minoan art, objects, administrative practices, and probably religious elements. The relationship was not simply one of strangers arriving from nowhere. For centuries, Crete and the mainland had watched each other across the sea. But after about 1450 BC, the balance changes. Knossos continues as an administrative center, and there, scribes use Linear B Greek. That is the strongest evidence that Greek-speaking Mycenaean elites had gained control of the palace system at Knossos. The transition may have involved violence, mainland connections already established on Crete, political alliances, mercenaries, trade, and opportunism after the destructions. A takeover does not have to happen in one afternoon. Imagine being a craft worker near Knossos during this transition. The palace still stands. The storage jars are still there. The roads still lead to the same court. You wake in the same house. You use the same tools. But the names at the top have changed. New officials speak another language. The old administrative script is replaced. Some ceremonies continue because new rulers need old legitimacy. Some symbols survive because they are useful. Some families keep their positions. Others disappear. Political conquest is often less visually dramatic for ordinary people than later stories make it. A flag does not fall from a palace roof because there are no national flags in the modern sense. The first sign may be a new demand, a new seal, a different name on a tablet. The palace economy continues, but the voice of administration has become Greek. This is why the end of Minoan civilization is hard to date with one number. Minoan people did not vanish in 1450 BC. The population of Crete remained. Local traditions continued. Art and religion mixed with Mycenaean forms. What ended was a political and cultural system that had developed over centuries. Even that ending was uneven. Knossos remained powerful for decades after the other major palaces were destroyed. Then Knossos too suffered destruction. The great palace ceased to function as it once had, probably around the later 15th or 14th century BC, depending on which destruction and chronology we mean. After that, the hill was not empty forever. People continued to live at Knossos in later periods. But the age of the great Minoan palace was over. There was no single last Minoan standing at a doorway watching civilization leave. There was a long transformation. A language lost administrative power. A script stopped being used. Palaces stopped organizing the island as they had before. Old symbols entered new contexts, and eventually, memory began its work. The Mycenaeans did not arrive in the Aegean as the opposite of the Minoans. That contrast became popular because the two cultures look different in some famous images. Knossos gives us open courts, flowing frescoes, marine designs, and a palace without the enormous stone fortification walls seen at Mycenae. Mycenae gives us the Lion Gate, heavy walls, shaft graves filled with weapons and gold, and images of hunting and war. It is easy to turn those differences into personalities. Minoans become peaceful artists. Mycenaeans become hard warriors. Real societies are never that tidy. The Mycenaeans learned a great deal from Crete. Minoan influence helped shape mainland elite art, religious practice, administration, and luxury culture. Mycenaean rulers wanted objects that looked Cretan. Craftspeople moved, designs moved, techniques moved. Linear B itself was adapted from an earlier Cretan writing tradition. When the mainlanders gained control at Knossos, they did not throw everything away. They used the palace. They used its administrative habits. They used a script derived from the island to write Greek. This is a common pattern in conquest. The conqueror often needs the machinery of the conquered. A palace is valuable because it already knows how to collect goods from a region. A bureaucracy is valuable because it already knows who produces wool, where sheep are kept, which fields belong to which district, and how much oil can be stored. Destroy all of that and you inherit ruins. Control it and you inherit revenue. The Linear B tablets from Knossos are dry documents. That is exactly why they are precious. They record sheep and rams, oil offerings, textile production, personnel, places, and the names of deities, some familiar from later Greek religion. These tablets do not tell us a heroic story of conquest. They tell us what happened after someone won. Someone started counting. The bureaucracy returned to work. If a Mycenaean ruler sat at Knossos, he lived inside an older world. Minoan architecture surrounded him. Minoan religious symbols surrounded him. Local people formed much of the population. The new elite continued to use old practices, and familiar forms could make political change feel less abrupt. And so the last palace phase at Knossos is not purely Minoan or purely Mycenaean. It is a layered society. This is one reason the word collapse can mislead us. When a state collapses, people remain. When a palace burns, farmers still wake the next morning unless they have also been killed or displaced. When a script disappears, the language may continue to be spoken for generations without being written. Culture changes through survivors. The people of Crete did not know they had crossed from one chapter title into another. They were adapting. Some probably hated the new order. Some benefited from it. Some may barely have noticed at first. Children grew up knowing only the changed world. Within a few generations, a political disaster becomes the way things have always been. There is a long stretch of Cretan history hidden inside that sentence. Between the destruction of most of the old palace centers in the 15th century BC and the wider crisis around 1200 BC, more than 2 centuries pass. Older histories sometimes move quickly through them because attention shifts toward Mycenae and the mainland. Crete itself can begin to look like a stage after the main actors have left. It was not. People were still building houses, burying their dead, making pottery, tending fields, moving goods, worshipping, and arguing over local power. The island had changed, but it had not become empty or culturally silent. Knossos gives us the clearest evidence for a period of Greek-speaking palace administration, but Knossos was never the whole island. Elsewhere, communities responded to the new order in different ways. Some places remained connected to older Cretan traditions. Some show stronger mainland influence. In many settings, the two become difficult to separate because people were already living inside a mixed world. A pot can be made in a mainland style by a person born on Crete. A Cretan religious symbol can remain meaningful under rulers who speak Greek. A family can adopt a new burial custom without changing every story it tells at home. This is why labels become dangerous again. If we call the people after the palace destructions Mycenaean, we can make the Cretan population disappear on paper. If we call everything Minoan, we can hide the political changes that really happened. The island after 1450 BC was neither a museum of the old world nor a blank copy of mainland Greece. It was becoming something new. The process lasted generations. A child born 50 years after the destructions would not remember the old palace system. By the time that child became old, the political disaster of an earlier generation had become family history. Another child might grow up surrounded by objects that mixed styles so completely that our modern categories would have meant nothing to them. Trade continued, though its routes and intensity changed. Settlements continued, though some gained importance while others declined. Burial practices changed. Elite display changed. Regional differences became more visible as the old palace network stopped holding Crete together in the same way. Western Crete gives this later world a more solid shape. Beneath modern Chania lay the Bronze Age center of Cydonia, which became important in the centuries after the old palace system had broken apart. From Western Crete came large transport jars, some carrying short linear B inscriptions painted onto the clay before they traveled. Imagine one of those jars before it becomes an archaeological object. It is filled, sealed, marked, lifted, and rolled or carried toward a ship. The painted signs are not a poem. They belong to administration and movement. Yet the jar may cross the sea and reach the Greek mainland, carrying Cretan produce and a few written signs with it. For tonight, that single container is useful. The palace age has changed, but the sea road is still open. People are still counting, shipping, receiving and reading marks on clay. This is an important kind of survival because it does not look heroic. No one announces that a civilization has entered its post-palace phase. A farmer sees a different official. A potter receives different orders. A family chooses a different kind of tomb. A sanctuary continues to receive offerings. A road that once led toward a palace still carries people long after the palace has stopped controlling their lives. For roughly 200 years, Crete lives in that altered condition. Then, in the wider eastern Mediterranean, another age of disruption approaches. Around 1200 BC, palace societies across Greece, Anatolia, the Levant and other regions face widespread crisis. Mycenaean palaces fall too. Crete changes with that crisis too. By the later 13th and 12th centuries BC, older urban patterns are breaking apart in many parts of the island. Some communities move. New settlements appear in places that would have seemed inconvenient during the palace age, including high ground with wide views and difficult approaches. One of the best known is Karphi, high in the mountains of eastern Crete. The settlement belongs mainly to the difficult transition from the end of the Bronze Age into the early Iron Age, around the 12th and 11th centuries BC. It has often been called a refuge settlement. The name creates an immediate picture. Frightened survivors climbing into the mountains while the old world burns below them. That may contain part of the truth, but recent work makes the story less simple. The movement toward defensible high places was not necessarily one single flight on one terrible day. Settlement patterns could change over years and generations. Communities can move because danger increases, because political networks fail, because access to land changes, or because several pressures arrive together. Karphi is still a remarkable place to end this part of the story. The great palace at Knossos had once gathered goods from a wide landscape into storerooms beside ceremonial courts. At Karphi, centuries later, people lived high in the mountains without anything like that old palatial machine. Houses stood close together. Families cooked, stored food, made things, worshipped, and raised children in a world where the Bronze Age palace system had become memory. And yet memory did not mean nothing survived. Religious practices carried older elements forward. Cretan traditions did not vanish when the political structures that had supported them disappeared. People reused ideas because ideas can travel through collapse more easily than bureaucracies. A palace needs accountants, storage, roads, labor, authority, and surplus. A story can survive in one household. A ritual can survive in a small room. A symbol can survive because someone teaches a child what to do with it, even if the old explanation changes along the way. This is why the end of the Minoans is better understood as a long transformation rather than one date. If we mean the great palace civilization, its ending begins centuries before Karphi. If we mean people on Crete carrying habits, images, rituals, and memories inherited from that world, the boundary becomes much harder to draw. The island does not pass from Minoan to Mycenaean to Greek as if three different populations take turns walking through the same door. People remain, mix, move, adapt, and rename the world around them. By the time later Greeks begin telling the stories that survive to us, the palaces are ruins, but the island is still inhabited, and the old places are still there. Centuries after Linear A disappeared from palace archives, another old Cretan voice appears in the east. At Prysos and Dreros, people carved a language that was not Greek using letters borrowed from the Greek alphabet. Modern scholars call it Aetio-Cretan, meaning true Cretan. These inscriptions belong to a much later age than Knossos at its height. They are not a hidden translation of Linear A, but they show that Greek did not erase every older language on Crete at once. Even after the palaces had become ruins, the island could still carry voices that reached back beyond the Greek world growing around them. It is a quiet survival, and it suits the story we have been following tonight. Buildings change faster than memory. Governments can disappear faster than habits. A language can retreat into one corner of an island and still leave a few words on stone. One of the most precious pieces came from Dreros. On the same inscription, Greek stood beside another language of Crete. The stone survived from the ancient world into the 20th century, only to disappear during the occupation of Crete in the Second World War. It has never been recovered. Sometimes the thread survives for more than 2,000 years and then breaks almost within living memory. The system that had absorbed Minoan Crete does not last forever. That is beyond the center of tonight's story, but it gives the ending a strange balance. The political order that replaced the Minoan palace system eventually disappeared too. Bronze Age states that looked permanent disappeared within a few centuries of one another. The stones remained, and later Greeks inherited a landscape full of ruins older than their own memories. Centuries pass. The great palace at Knossos is no longer a working center. Rooms collapse, wood disappears. Rain enters through broken roofs. Earthquakes disturb old walls. People reuse stone. New settlements grow over or beside ancient places. The Bronze Age becomes distant. But Crete does not disappear from Greek memory. Instead, it becomes older and stranger. Later Greeks tell stories about Zeus growing up on the island, about Europa arriving on the back of a bull, about Minos ruling the sea, about Daedalus building impossible things, about Icarus flying too close to the sun, about Ariadne waiting at the edge of the labyrinth, about Theseus entering darkness and returning alive. The stories do not preserve Minoan history like an archive. They are not damaged newspaper reports. They belong to later societies with their own politics, religion, fears, and identities. Athenians had reasons to tell a story in which Athens once suffered under Cretan power and then produced the hero who broke it. Cretans had their own local traditions. Poets changed details. Artists changed details. Different versions existed at the same time. Myth is alive because it does not stay still. Yet old places can hold memory in ways texts cannot. A ruined palace may remain associated with a name for centuries. A ritual involving bulls may survive as a story after the ritual itself is gone. A political relationship between Crete and the mainland can become tribute in legend. That is how cultural memory works. Real places and old relationships survive while later storytellers reshape their meaning. Human beings are good at carrying stories longer than they carry explanations. A grandmother tells a child that the hill once belonged to a king. The child tells another child. The king becomes crueler. The building becomes larger. A dangerous animal becomes a monster. A confusing ruin becomes a maze. Eventually, the story can travel farther than the ruins themselves. By the time classical Greek artists paint Theseus and the Minotaur on pottery, the Minoan palace age has been gone for roughly 1,000 years. Think about that distance. 1,000 years is enough time for languages to change, states to rise and fall, religions to transform, and entire political systems to become difficult to imagine. Still, the bull remains. Minos remains. Crete remains. The labyrinth remains. Something survived. The surviving memory came mixed with later invention, and centuries of retelling fused the two. That is a fitting ending for the ancient part of the story. The Minoans themselves did not leave us a history book. The Greeks left us stories. Then, much later, archaeology came back to the hill with shovels. And a man named Arthur Evans decided he knew what he was looking at. Arthur Evans was not the first person to put a spade into Knossos. That detail sometimes disappears because his name became so closely attached to the site. In 1878, a Cretan antiquarian and merchant named Minos Kalokairinos excavated part of the mound and uncovered storage magazines with large pythoi. The discoveries showed that something important lay beneath the hill. But Crete was still under Ottoman rule, and politics made large excavation difficult. Several archaeologists and institutions became interested in the site. Heinrich Schliemann, already famous for his excavations at Troy and Mycenae, tried to acquire the land but failed to reach an agreement. Then the political world changed. After years of conflict, Crete became an autonomous state under nominal Ottoman sovereignty in 1898. Conditions for excavation opened in a new way. Evans bought the land at Knossos. In March 1900, digging began. The speed of discovery was extraordinary. Within weeks, workers were uncovering major architectural features. The throne room appeared in April. Tablets emerged. Fresco fragments came out of the soil. The scale of the site became clear much faster than anyone could properly absorb it. Evans had come prepared with ideas. That is normal. Archaeologists do not arrive as empty minds. They read earlier texts, study objects, form expectations, and then test those expectations against the ground. The danger begins when the ground is forced to agree. Evans believed he had found the civilization behind the legends of Minos. He called it Minoan. He divided its history into early, middle, and late periods, then subdivided those categories further, creating a chronological system that influenced Aegean archaeology for generations. He carefully recorded enormous quantities of material. He employed specialists. He preserved objects that might otherwise have been lost. His work made Knossos central to the modern understanding of Bronze Age Crete. None of that is small, but Evans also interpreted the Minoans through the concerns of his own age. He preferred a vision of them as elegant, orderly, maritime, artistic, and comparatively peaceful. They became, in his writing, almost a lost European civilization before classical Greece. The idea was appealing. Europe in the early 20th century was obsessed with origins. Nations wanted deep pasts. Scholars wanted to know where European civilization began. Knossos seemed to provide an answer older than Athens. Evans sometimes described Minoan political power in ways that reflected modern assumptions about monarchy and empire. The large complex became a palace. A stone seat became a throne. Knossos became the center of a sea power ruled by kings in the line of Minos. Some of those interpretations may be partly right, but the vocabulary came before the proof. There is another complication. Most of the people physically digging Knossos were Cretan workers. They moved the earth, recognized changes in soil, exposed walls, lifted finds, rebuilt damaged structures, and worked through difficult conditions. Early archaeology often placed the foreign director at the center of the published story and left local laborers at the edge of the photograph. But Knossos did not rise from the ground because one Englishman discovered it alone. Archaeology is physical work. A site the size of Knossos required many hands. Evans's deputy Duncan Mackenzie kept detailed excavation notebooks and played a major role in recording the site. Architects such as Theodore Fife, Christian Doll, and later Piet de Jong helped document and reconstruct its architecture. Artists restored frescoes from fragments, sometimes making choices that would shape what millions of later viewers thought Minoan art looked like. Modern Knossos is therefore a meeting place of several times. There is the Bronze Age building. There are later ancient phases. There is the excavation of 1900 and the decades after it. There are 20th century restorations. There is the modern tourist site. All of them occupy the same hill. When you look at a photograph of Knossos and see red columns, black capitals, painted walls, and reconstructed upper stories, you are not looking through a clean window into 1500 BC. You are looking at an archaeological argument built in concrete. Evans wanted visitors to see the palace rather than only foundations. To do that, he made decisions. where a column should stand. How high a wall might have been. What color a surface should carry. How fragments of fresco belonged together. Some decisions were based closely on excavation evidence. Others required more imagination. The result saved parts of the site and transformed others. That double truth is important. Without intervention, exposed architecture can decay quickly. Rain enters. Plaster breaks. Wooden supports rot. Stone shifts. Evans saw some of that damage almost immediately after the first excavation season. He had to protect what had been uncovered. But protection slowly became reconstruction, and reconstruction became interpretation. The palace did not only emerge from the earth, in part it was rebuilt inside Evans's idea of Minos. The grand staircase was a problem. It descended more than 7 meters below the level of the central court through several stories. Much of the ancient wooden structure was gone. Winter rain threatened what survived. If nothing was done, excavation could become destruction. Christian Doll, one of the architects working with Evans in the early 1900s, used modern materials to stabilize parts of the building. Steel joists and brick vaulting were introduced. Ancient wooden columns that had vanished but left traces were replaced. Later, reinforced concrete became increasingly important. By the 1920s, Piet de Jong worked with Evans on more ambitious reconstructions. Evans called the process reconstitution. The idea was not simply to put a roof over an ancient wall. It was to suggest what the building had looked like. This is where modern visitors meet the most famous Knossos. Tapering columns painted dark red, black capitals, bright frescoes. Upper walls standing above ancient foundations. A north entrance with a charging bull in painted relief. A throne room that feels like a room rather than a collection of stones. It is visually powerful. It is also controversial. The fresco problem shows why. Ancient wall paintings often survive as fragments. A piece of a shoulder, part of a face, a flower, a line of clothing, a patch of blue ground. To display them as complete scenes, restorers had to decide how the pieces fit together and what filled the missing spaces. Sometimes there was enough evidence to make a strong reconstruction. Sometimes there was not. A completed image can look certain even when much of it is modern paint. The eye does not naturally separate ancient fragment from 20th century guess. Once the completed image appears in books, posters, documentaries, and school lessons, the reconstruction becomes the past in public memory. This is not unique to Knossos. Every archaeological display makes choices. A museum arranges fragments. A drawing fills a missing roof. A digital model chooses the height of a wall. The difference at Knossos is scale. Evans placed the interpretation on the site itself. You can walk through it. That makes the interpretation difficult to forget. It also creates a strange experience. The reconstructed palace is not fake in the simple sense. There are real Bronze Age walls beneath and around it. The locations of major rooms are real. Architectural evidence guided much of the rebuilding. Ancient fragments inspired the fresco restorations. But it is not untouched Bronze Age architecture either. It is a hybrid. That makes Knossos an appropriate place for the Minoans. Everything about them sits between surviving material and modern reconstruction. Their name comes from myth. Their language is partly unreadable. Their religion is reconstructed from images and objects. Their political system is inferred from buildings. Their most famous palace is partly ancient and partly modern. We keep meeting them through layers. Evans died in 1941. By then, the civilization he named had become famous. The word Minoan was permanent. The Palace of Minos filled volumes of his publications, and his vision of a graceful sea power had entered popular culture. Later, archaeologists revised many details. Chronologies changed. Ideas about political organization changed. The image of a completely peaceful society weakened. The role of women became more carefully debated. The relationship between Knossos and other Cretan centers became less easy to describe as one centralized kingdom. The Thera eruption stopped functioning as a simple explanation for the end. Even the word palace has been questioned because it brings assumptions about kingship. But revision does not erase Evans. Modern scholarship still works with categories he helped establish, even when it argues with them. A field can outgrow its founder without escaping him. And one thing Evans understood very clearly was that Knossos was not a minor site. The hill had preserved the center of a civilization whose existence changed the story of the ancient Aegean. Before classical Greece, before the poems of Homer reached the form we know, before the city-states that dominate Greek history, there had been another complex world on Crete. It built in stone and timber. It painted its walls. It wrote on clay. It crossed the sea. And it disappeared so completely from readable history that its modern discoverers had to borrow a king from myth just to give it a name. There is a danger in spending too long with palaces. The building becomes the civilization. So before we leave ancient Crete, imagine one ordinary day. Not a festival, not an eruption, not a palace burning, just a morning. Light reaches the plain around Knossos early. In the fields beyond the settlement, people are already working because summer heat rewards an early start. Grain has its season. Grapes have theirs. Olives come later in the year. Sheep and goats have to be moved and watched regardless of what officials are doing inside the palace. Near a house, someone grinds grain. The work is repetitive and necessary. A child carries water. Another is told to move out of the way. Smoke rises from a cooking fire. The meal would be recognizable in ingredients, even if not in exact recipe. Cereals, legumes, olives and oil, fruit when available, wine. Meat less constantly than modern abundance might make us imagine, but animals are part of food, farming, sacrifice and wealth. Fish and shellfish connect the table to the sea. Archaeological study at Knossos has recovered food remains stretching back to the earliest settlement. The things people ate changed over thousands of years, but farming was always more fundamental than palace frescoes make it look. Inside the town, a potter checks vessels that have dried enough for firing. A badly cracked pot is put aside. A good one may travel farther than its maker ever will. Near the palace, a delivery arrives. Perhaps it is oil, perhaps wool, perhaps grain. A seal helps identify responsibility. A scribe records a quantity. The scribe does not write literature. Administration almost never survives because people think it is beautiful. It survives because a fire accidentally bakes the clay hard enough for archaeologists to find it later. In another part of the complex, someone cleans a floor before a ceremony. Someone else repairs damaged plaster. A carpenter works where wooden architecture needs attention. A storeroom smells of clay, oil, dust, and old grain. The central court fills and empties as people cross it. Not everyone who enters Knossos belongs to an elite family. Palaces need porters, cleaners, craft workers, messengers, animal handlers, cooks, guards or attendants, scribes, religious personnel, managers, people whose jobs have no surviving title because Linear A will not tell us what they were called. At some point in the day, a ship is visible from the northern coast. It may not be connected to Knossos directly, but news travels inland. A cargo has arrived. Foreign objects are interesting because they carry stories. Someone sees an Egyptian object for the first time. Someone hears a language they do not understand. Someone recognizes a sailor from an earlier visit. Trade is not a line on a map. It is people entering one another's days. In the afternoon, the heat settles heavily. Work slows where it can. In shaded rooms, the difference is noticeable. Architectural features such as light wells and internal courts help manage a building that would otherwise become dark and airless. Water moves through channels. Not every channel is a miraculous piece of advanced plumbing, and modern descriptions sometimes exaggerate Minoan technology. But the builders did understand drainage and water management in practical ways. Then evening comes. Oil lamps begin to matter. The palace changes after sunset. Painted walls lose their daylight brightness. Corridors that are easy to read in the afternoon become uncertain. A flame lights only a small area. Corners disappear. The building that later generations will call a labyrinth probably feels more like one at night. Somewhere, a door is closed. Somewhere, a jar is sealed. A final account may be checked. People leave the palace and walk home. Nothing important happens. That is why the day matters. A civilization survives because thousands of ordinary days happen between disasters. Thera is memorable because it erupted once. Knossos mattered because people returned to it every morning for centuries. Palaces tell us how people organized life. Graves show another side of the society. Minoan burial practices changed across time and place. Crete did not use one single kind of tomb for 1,500 years. In some regions and periods, communities used circular stone tombs, often called tholos tombs, especially in the Masara plain. Elsewhere, the dead were placed in house-shaped or chamber-like tombs, rock-cut spaces, caves, or large pottery containers known as larnax in later periods. Bodies might be moved or rearranged after decomposition as tombs were reused. Burial was often a continuing relationship rather than a single sealed event. Objects accompanied the dead: pottery, tools, weapons in some contexts, jewelry, seals, food or drink offerings. Again, the meaning is harder to recover than the object. A cup in a grave might suggest a belief about providing for the dead. It might be part of a funeral meal. It might symbolize status. It might do several things at once. Without readable religious texts, we should not build a complete Minoan afterlife from grave goods alone. One late object lets us watch a funerary ceremony more directly, although it comes with an important warning about date. The Hagia Triada sarcophagus was made around 1370 to 1320 BC. That places it after the destruction of many Minoan palatial centers, and during the period when Mycenaean Greek influence and control were already strong on Crete. So we should not take every image on it and project it backward unchanged into the world of Knossos 2 or 3 centuries earlier. Still, it was found on Crete, and its paintings preserve a remarkable view of ritual in the island's later Bronze Age. The sarcophagus is a stone chest covered with plaster and painted on several sides. People approach in procession. Vessels are carried. Liquid is poured as an offering. Musicians appear. On another side, a bull is shown bound on a table while blood flows into a vessel below. Other animals wait nearby. The scene is calm in the way ritual art often is calm. No one in the painting looks surprised by what is happening. Every person appears to know where to stand and what to carry. That may be the most useful detail. Funerals are not only expressions of grief. They are organized actions. Someone prepares the body. Someone brings the container. Someone provides food, drink, animals, cloth, music, or labor. Someone knows the words, even when those words are now lost. The sarcophagus also reminds us how difficult it is to separate religious traditions into clean boxes called Minoan and Mycenaean. Cultures do not change uniforms overnight. After political power shifts, local practices can continue. New practices can arrive. Symbols can be borrowed, adapted, or reinterpreted. A ceremony may contain elements whose history is already centuries old beside others that are relatively new. By the time this sarcophagus was painted, the old palace world had changed profoundly. But Crete had not forgotten how to make ritual visible. The living still gathered around the dead. They still poured liquids. They still carried offerings. They still used animals, music, movement, and images to give shape to a moment that every society has to face. We can see the ceremony. We still cannot hear it. But burial does tell us that the dead remained socially important. A tomb used by a community over generations becomes a place of memory. Children grow up knowing where ancestors are placed. Families return. Old bones are encountered when new dead arrive. The boundary between present and past is physical. There is something useful here for understanding later Greek myth. The Greeks who inherited Crete did not inherit an empty island. They lived among ancient tombs, old walls, caves filled with offerings, ruined palace architecture, and objects that no one could read. The landscape itself was full of previous people. When stories formed around Minos, Zeus, Daedalus, and the labyrinth, they formed in a place already crowded with remains. Modern people sometimes imagine that archaeology discovered the ancient past for local populations. Of course it did not. People living near Knossos knew there were ruins on the hill. Minos Kalokairinos did not need Arthur Evans to tell him that antiquity lay there. Farmers encounter pottery. Builders encounter walls. Shepherds pass caves containing old offerings. The difference is not between knowledge and ignorance. It is between different ways of explaining what survives. A local story can preserve a name. An archaeologist can establish a date. A chemist can identify residue in a jar. A linguist can compare signs. None alone recreates the whole world. The dead remain incomplete. That may sound disappointing. It should not. Incomplete knowledge is still knowledge. We know far more about Minoan Crete now than Evans did when he first entered the throne room. We understand trade networks more clearly. Scientific dating has refined chronologies. Archaeobotany and zooarchaeology recover diet and agriculture from seeds and bones that older excavators sometimes ignored. Microscopic residues reveal materials that vanished to the eye. DNA and isotope studies can ask questions about movement and ancestry that were once impossible. Digital recording can separate excavation phases more carefully. And yet, the largest questions remain stubborn. The dead give us enough to know they were real, not enough to make them simple. One of the pleasures of Minoan art is that the sea keeps entering the house. An octopus stretches across a jar. Dolphins move through painted water. Shells, fish, rocks, and marine plants become decoration. The marine style of later Minoan pottery seems almost unwilling to respect the shape of the vessel. Tentacles curve around the clay. Creatures move across the surface instead of sitting inside neat borders. It is easy to romanticize this. People living on an island painted sea animals because they loved nature. Maybe they did. But the sea was not only beautiful. It was work. It was food. It was trade. It was distance. It was the place where a ship could disappear. The same water that made Crete wealthy connected the island to danger. Storms do not care whether a cargo belongs to a palace. Piracy was part of the ancient Mediterranean world, adding another danger to the same sea routes that carried trade and wealth. Foreign powers could arrive by the same routes merchants used. Thera's eruption sent violence through the sea itself. The sea made Crete central and exposed at the same time. Perhaps that is why the later legend of Minos makes him a ruler of ships. Perhaps it is coincidence. But a landlocked Minos would feel wrong. The king belongs to an island whose power, whatever its exact political form, depended on looking outward. This outward connection also makes the Minoans difficult to place inside modern categories. Were they European? Geographically, Crete is part of Europe today. But Bronze Age people did not organize the world according to modern continents and identities. Minoan Crete was deeply connected with Egypt and the Eastern Mediterranean, as well as with mainland Greece and the Cyclades. Its culture grew from local development and international contact together. Calling it Europe's first advanced civilization, as popular accounts often do, can be useful as a rough description of chronology. It can also make us imagine a boundary the Minoans themselves would not have recognized. For them, the important map may have been made of sailing time, a day to one island, several days to another coast, a dangerous season, a familiar harbor, a place where Cretan pottery sells well, a place where copper can be acquired, a place where an Egyptian official expects gifts. The world is measured by routes, and routes create stories. A sailor returns from Egypt with an object no one in his village has seen. A craft worker copies it imperfectly and creates something new. A foreign visitor sees a Cretan ceremony and describes it badly at home. A child grows up hearing the description. Cultures misunderstand each other productively all the time. Some of the most interesting things in history begin as imitation, adaptation, or confusion. Minoan Crete was not a sealed culture producing itself alone. No civilization is. The palace at Knossos contained the sea even when the doors were closed. In the oil stored in jars, in imported materials, in motifs painted on walls, in news arriving from ports, in the wealth that maritime exchange made possible, and eventually perhaps in the forces that made the old system impossible to maintain. There is one force we have passed several times without stopping long enough to feel it: the ground itself. Crete lies in an active part of the eastern Mediterranean. Earthquakes are not rare accidents in the island's long history. They are part of the environment in which people built. That does not mean every broken wall at a Minoan site was destroyed by an earthquake. Archaeologists have learned to be cautious with that explanation because it is convenient. A collapsed building can have many causes. Fire can weaken structures. Abandonment can allow walls to fall slowly. Human destruction can be followed by later seismic damage. Several events can become mixed together in the archaeological layer. But earthquakes certainly happened. The people of Bronze Age Crete knew what it meant for the floor to move. Imagine being inside a multi-story building when it begins. There is no warning from a phone. No scientific agency reports an epicenter afterward. First, there may be a sound, then movement. Jars shift against one another. Objects fall from shelves. Wooden beams flex, plaster cracks. A staircase fills with people trying to get outside. An oil lamp falls and fire becomes a second danger. Then it stops, or seems to stop. Aftershocks come later. People return cautiously to rooms they knew perfectly an hour before and find that familiar space has changed. A doorway is blocked, a wall has opened, a storage jar has broken, and oil spreads across the floor. Someone is missing. The palace has to be inspected, and then people do what people on Crete have done after earthquakes for thousands of years. They rebuild. This repeated rebuilding helps explain why Knossos is so difficult to reduce to one plan. The palace was not designed once by a single architect and then preserved unchanged for 6 centuries. It was altered. Rooms changed use. Walls were added or removed. Floors were raised. Damage was repaired. New decoration covered old surfaces. Different generations inherited a building that already contained the decisions of earlier generations. That is how old buildings work. A palace can become complicated without anyone intending to create a maze. One family repairs a corridor. Another ruler expands a court. A damaged wing is rebuilt differently. A stair no longer serves the same floor because the floor above has changed. After centuries, complexity accumulates. This may be a more useful path toward the labyrinth than imagining one architect deliberately drawing a puzzle. The building became difficult because it was alive for a long time. Natural disaster also changes politics in ways that walls cannot record clearly. A ruler whose authority depends on organizing food, ritual, and labor faces a serious test after an earthquake. Who receives grain from the stores? Which district gets workers first? Who pays for rebuilding? Which shrine is repaired? What happens if another center recovers faster? A disaster can strengthen central authority if the palace responds effectively. It can weaken authority if people decide the system has failed. Again, we do not have the Minoan speeches. We have repair phases. One of the reasons collapse stories become too simple is that modern viewers naturally focus on the final destruction. A palace burns and we ask what killed the civilization. But a society may have survived dozens of earlier shocks. The better question may be why one crisis was recoverable and another was not. Knossos survived destruction around the end of the First Palace period and rose again on a grand scale. Crete survived the Thera eruption. Many communities survived earthquakes. The system was resilient until, eventually, The combination of political and economic changes around the 15th century transformed it beyond recognition. Resilience is not immortality. Sometimes surviving one disaster creates the conditions for vulnerability to the next. Rebuilding consumes resources. Trade disruption reduces reserves. Political rivals grow stronger. Old institutions become expensive to maintain. A new elite offers a different arrangement. There is no need for one final curse. The Bronze Age world was held together by human systems, and human systems can fail after working for a very long time. This matters because the later myth gives Knossos one perfect architectural problem. The labyrinth is built to contain one monster. Real Knossos was almost the opposite. It was built, rebuilt, repaired, extended, damaged, and reorganized to contain ordinary life. That is much messier and much more human. We have reached the point where a traditional history would usually return to kings, battles, and named dynasties. Crete gives us a different kind of history. It gives us Knossos, built and rebuilt over generations. It gives us Phaistos, Malea, Zakros, Gornia, mountain sanctuaries, ports, workshops, graves, roads, and storerooms. It gives us ships moving between Crete and distant shores. It gives us scribes pressing linear A into clay, artists painting bulls and processions, farmers working fields, craftspeople carving stone and shaping metal, and communities carrying offerings into caves and up mountain paths. It gives us Thera exploding across the sea, followed generations later by destruction across many Cretan centers. It gives us a transformed Knossos, where Greek-speaking administrators used linear B. It gives us the end of the old palace system and the survival of Cretan people beyond it. Then, later, Greece adds Minos, Ariadne, Theseus, the Labyrinth, and the Minotaur. Centuries after that, Arthur Evans returns to the hill, uncovers the palace, and gives the Bronze Age civilization the name Minoan. The names of many individual rulers disappeared. The political map shifted too often to survive as one simple diagram. Linear A still keeps most personal voices behind its signs. But the civilization itself is not vague. Its buildings, roads, storage systems, ships, art, religious spaces, writing and trade networks are physical facts. That is the world we have been walking through tonight. Prehistoric history becomes strongest when the surviving material is allowed to carry the story. That matters especially with a civilization whose written language is still largely silent. The Minoans attract this more than most. They have been turned into pacifists, matriarchs, Atlantis survivors, mystics, a lost utopia, an empire destroyed in one night by a volcano, a civilization secretly described exactly by Greek myth. Those stories flatten a society that was as complicated as every other human society. There would have been generosity and exploitation, beauty and boredom, ritual and fraud, love, grief, ambition, fear, status, labor, and conflict. The frescoes survived better than the arguments. That is why the civilization can look happier than it was. No one paints the ordinary bad week on a palace wall. No one decorates a ceremonial cup with a picture of unpaid work. The surviving image of a society is shaped by what elites choose to make and what accidents allow to survive. A burned administrative tablet may tell us more about ordinary life than a masterpiece of art. A sheep count is not beautiful. But a sheep count tells us someone was responsible for sheep. It tells us a bureaucracy cared how many existed. It tells us labor, wool, land, and obligation were being organized. Boring evidence is often the most honest evidence we have. Linear A remains frustrating precisely because the surviving tablets look so ordinary. There are probably boring answers inside it. Names, quantities, deliveries. The things that would make the Minoans less mysterious and more human. One day, the script may be understood. A bilingual text may be found. A longer archive may appear. A method may succeed where earlier attempts failed. If that happens, some of tonight's silences will disappear. Others will remain. Deciphering Egyptian hieroglyphs did not answer every question about Egypt. Reading Linear B did not make Mycenaean society simple. The past always keeps something. There is one person in the labyrinth story who understands the building better than the hero does: Ariadne. Theseus arrives from Athens with courage, a plan to kill the Minotaur, and no reliable way to return once he has gone inside. Ariadne gives him the part he is missing: the thread. That small detail survives because it solves a simple problem. Killing the monster is not enough. You have to find the door again. Later versions of the myth disagree about what happens between Ariadne and Theseus after they leave Crete. They sail away together. They reach the island of Knossos. Then Ariadne is abandoned, left or separated from Theseus through divine intervention, depending on the version being told. The god Dionysus becomes connected with her story. In some traditions, Ariadne becomes his wife. Theseus continues toward Athens. And then another mistake happens. Before leaving, he had arranged a signal with his father, Aegeus. If Theseus survived, the returning ship would raise a white sail instead of the dark sail it had carried when it left. Theseus forgets to change it. Aegeus sees the dark sail from the coast and believes his son is dead. He throws himself into the sea. Later tradition connects his name with the Aegean. Again, we are fully inside myth now. But notice what the story has done to Crete. It has turned a Bronze Age island into the beginning of an Athenian hero's adulthood. Theseus goes to the old power, defeats its monster, takes the king's daughter away, and returns to inherit his father's place. Crete becomes the dangerous older world that Athens must overcome. That makes sense for Athenians telling the story centuries later. Myth is rarely neutral geography. Places acquire roles. Troy becomes the city Greeks once destroyed. Thebes becomes the city of terrible family stories. Crete becomes the island of Minos, bulls, strange craftsmanship, and a maze. And Daedalus may be the best example of how much later Greece imagined ancient Crete as a place of technical knowledge. He is the builder of the labyrinth. He creates the artificial cow that allows Pasiphae to approach the bull. He makes images so lifelike that later stories almost treat them as living. And when Minos refuses to let him leave Crete, Daedalus solves the problem by building wings. He and his son Icarus take to the air. The warning is simple: do not fly too low, where sea spray will weigh down the feathers. Do not fly too high, where the heat of the sun will soften the wax. Icarus rises. The wings fail. He falls into the sea. It is one of those myths that became so familiar that its Cretan beginning is easy to forget. Daedalus is trapped because he knows too much about Minos's secrets. The island is both a center of extraordinary skill and a place from which a skilled man has to escape. That combination may tell us more about Greek imagination than Bronze Age technology. Still, the archaeological Knossos probably encouraged it. To later visitors, the ruins would have represented engineering from a world no one could fully explain. Multi-story architecture, complex drainage, massive storage systems, fine stonework, painted plaster, seals cut with tiny seams, objects that required technical knowledge to produce. A later society does not need blueprints to understand that skilled people once lived there. It needs a name for the skill. Daedalus became that name. Even his name was later associated with clever workmanship. The stories spread far beyond Crete. Greek vase painters showed Theseus killing the Minotaur. Poets retold Ariadne's abandonment. Roman writers inherited the stories. Artists in medieval and Renaissance Europe found the labyrinth again. The Minotaur changed shape repeatedly. Sometimes it was shown with a man's body and bull's head, sometimes with a bull's body and human elements. The maze changed too, becoming a symbol of confusion, sin, danger, knowledge, or the difficult path toward a center. By the time modern archaeology arrived, Europe already knew what Knossos was supposed to contain. That is important. Evans did not discover ruins in a cultural vacuum. He discovered them beneath thousands of years of storytelling. When bull imagery appeared, the Minotaur was already waiting in his mind. When corridors multiplied, the labyrinth was already there. When he found a grand seat, Minos already had a throne. The ancient evidence and the later story met immediately. They have been difficult to separate ever since. This does not make the myths useless to historians. It changes the question we ask of them. Instead of asking whether Theseus literally killed a bull-headed creature under Knossos, we can ask why later Greeks placed that creature there. Instead of asking whether Ariadne's thread proves a real maze existed, we can ask why Crete became associated with confusing architecture. Instead of treating Minos as a king list entry, we can ask why later memory gave Crete one ruler powerful enough to dominate the sea and frighten Athens. Myth does not have to be factual to preserve historical relationships. But it also does not have to preserve them. Sometimes a story is simply a good story. The discipline is knowing that both possibilities remain open. And there is another reason Ariadne belongs near the end of tonight's story. She is remembered for a thread, a thin line carried into a place that is difficult to understand. Archaeology works with threads too. A pottery style found in 2 harbors, a layer of volcanic ash, a seal impression, a sheep count on a tablet, a fragment of painted plaster, a few signs repeated in linear a destruction layer at one palace and another. None is the whole building. Each is a way back through it. The problem is that our thread breaks often. A script cannot be read. A room has been rebuilt too many times. A grave was robbed. An old excavation failed to record soil carefully. A myth was written down 1,000 years late. Then we tie another piece on and continue. We may never reach the exact center. That is fine. The point of entering the labyrinth was never to pretend there were no turns. It is late at Knossos. Not in 1900 now. Go back farther. Much farther. The palace is still alive. A lamp burns in a room that will one day be called something else by archaeologists. The person carrying it does not know the word Minoan. He has never heard of Arthur Evans. He does not know that people will one day stare at the walls around him through museum glass and guidebooks. He knows the name of his town. He knows the people he works for. He knows which god receives an offering tomorrow. He knows which harbor a ship is expected from. He knows the signs on the tablet in his hand. Everything we want to know is ordinary to him. He walks down a corridor. The flame moves with him. Painted plaster catches light for a moment and disappears again. A storage jar stands in shadow. Somewhere outside, an animal moves. There is nothing supernatural in the building. No minotaur waits below. No hero is coming from Athens. No thread lies across the floor. Those things belong to another time. For now, there are only people. That may be the simplest way to leave Crete. The Minoans were not a mystery civilization while they were alive. They became mysterious because the chain of explanation broke. Their script stopped being read. Their political system disappeared. Their buildings became ruins. Other people arrived, remembered fragments, invented new stories, and attached old names to old stones. Then archaeologists arrived and did something similar in a more disciplined way. They measured, they recorded, they compared. They also imagined. That last part can never be removed completely. Anytime we rebuild a room in our minds, imagination fills the spaces between surviving walls, objects, and texts. The goal is not to stop imagining. It is to let the surviving material lead the reconstruction. Tonight, we began with a building that was still working, and we have ended with the men who came back to dig it out of the ground. Arthur Evans saw a gypsum seat and called the space the throne room. He saw a vast building and called it the Palace of Minos. He saw the remains of a Bronze Age culture and gave its people the name Minoan. The names stayed. They are useful. But underneath them are people whose own names are mostly gone. A farmer on the Messara plain, a potter at Malea, a sailor leaving Zakros, a woman carrying an offering up a mountain path, a child watching a procession at Knossos, a scribe pressing linear A into wet clay, a worker repairing a staircase after an earthquake, a family hearing that something terrible has happened on Thera, a palace official discovering that another Cretan center has burned, a local craft worker continuing his job after Greek-speaking rulers take control. None of them knows that historians will later argue over when their civilization ended. People rarely experience an ending with the clean edges we give it afterward. They experience a bad harvest, a burned building, a new official, a ship that does not arrive, a road that is no longer safe, a ritual that stops being performed, a word their children no longer use. Then enough small changes accumulate that the old world exists only in memory. By the time Greeks tell the story of Theseus, the palace age is already ancient. By the time Evans digs at Knossos, Theseus is ancient too. Now, Evans's excavation is more than a century behind us. The layers continue. And the strange thing is that Knossos is still changing. Not the Bronze Age walls themselves, at least not in the way they once changed, but our understanding of them. A new excavation finds another deposit. A scientific test changes a date. A scholar challenges an old reconstruction. A digital model removes a concrete wall to show what Evans originally uncovered beneath it. An inscription is studied again. A tiny seed is identified. The civilization moves slightly closer. Never all the way. Perhaps it should not. The real island is stronger than the simplifications later attached to it. Minos belongs to the legend that grew around Crete. Thera was one disaster inside a much longer history of rebuilding and political change. Female figures belong to a rich ritual world, and bulls carried meanings far wider than the Minotaur. The real island is enough. A civilization grew there before classical Greece. It built huge architectural complexes without leaving us readable royal inscriptions. It developed art that still feels alive thousands of years later. It connected Crete to the wider Mediterranean by sea. It survived earthquakes, rebuilt palaces, adapted after catastrophe, and eventually changed under new political power. Then its language disappeared from writing. Its rulers disappeared from memory. And one legendary name remained large enough to cover them all: Minos. Outside the palace, the night is quiet. The sea is beyond the hills, invisible from the room but never truly far away. The lamp moves again. A man turns a corner. For one moment, the light touches a painted wall. Then he is gone. The wall remains. And much later, we find it.